Perfect. Well, let's get this webinar kicked off. I want to thank everyone for coming, to all of our attendees, and then Daryl Sirota for being my co-partner for another episode of Turning the Page and Cloud Options for your ERP application. So Daryl Sirota is the VP of Technology over here at the Estes Group, and I am the Sales Director. So we fall on two sides of the same coin, but we will be basically running through kind of what the landscape looks like, overall different options for solutions for your ERP. And then Daryl will go over some of those technical aspects that anyone that's kind of having that question of should they stay on site or look at the other options will probably want to know. So some initial housekeeping items. The meeting will be recorded and it's going to be made available. So we'll actually post it online and it should go out to all of the attendees that are on this webinar. If you guys have any questions, everyone is on mute throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions and we will get to them more towards the end. If you have any questions of the current subject matter, just feel free to raise your hand in the Q&A feature and we will try to get to them as timely as possible. Thanks for coming, everybody. All right, so understanding your cloud ERP options, there's a ton of ERP solutions out there, and the traditional approach has been thus far of kind of an on-prem solution with a server and managing everything internally. As businesses have moved forward, there have been vast shifts in the technology and options of how you can actually stand your ERP solution up for your company. So some of the general considerations when you're kind of thinking about staying on site or looking at cloud options are some of those key business drivers. There's a lot of clouds out there, not all of them are created equal. So it's really about your business and your functionality and capabilities that you need for you. Is it a flexible solution? You need a flexible solution. Can it scale with your organization? And then what are some of those controls and integration needs? Not every cloud gives you access to the environment. SaaS solutions are a little bit more restrictive than a private cloud that's more, the resources and management is spun up much more of a on-prem solution. Another huge driving factor for should we take our ERP cloud is cost. You're basically switching from a capital expense to an operation expense. ROI in the past has not always aligned with staying on site, but that has come very close over the last few years to make it a more cost-effective solution when vetting is cloud the right option for your ERP. There's also ingress and egress fees. There can even be project management from doing a large-scale migration of your infrastructure and your ERP solution to the cloud. So these are all considerations that businesses should take up when vetting cloud options. Then there's also data center requirements. Depending on your business model and requirements, you might have to be HIPAA compliant, you might have to have ITAR compliance. So that's another huge factor if you're looking at cloud options, because not all data centers align with those compliance needs. So one of the options out there when you're looking at cloud options for your ERP is, they call it SaaS in the industry, and it stands for software as a service. This is really a subscription model, such as Office 365, that's the SaaS model of Exchange on-prem, and many ERPs are kind of making that leap as well. Software as a service ERP solution is found a lot in the industry on smaller ERP applications, and larger applications are definitely shifting that way. It's great for customers that don't have the internal expertise, don't want to manage their own hardware on site, have a limited IT staff, don't have a lot of integrations or customizations within their ERP application. SaaS tends to lend very well towards them. Some of the drawbacks with a SaaS-based solution is you don't have the same access to your data, which can be problematic for people that use third-party integrations, applications, or have specific network requirements, such as SQL pulling out to do different reports and jobs. So SaaS fits for some customers, and other customers, they need more of that granular access. And a private cloud hosted solution is going to be probably a much better option. As I mentioned earlier, there is obviously the on-premise installation. A lot of people's ERP systems still sit on-prem. And when you're thinking of should I take a look at cloud options? Should we move from that CapEx expense to that operation expense? I think a good piece that gets looked over is all of those kind of hidden costs that aren't related just to physical hardware. So when you're evaluating for your organization, it's time to do that refresh. And should you go cloud or should you stay on site? You probably also want to look at, do you need high availability, and do you have the infrastructure footprint to deploy that? Do you have a disaster recovery solution where you can maintain your ERP application if you're a multi-site location? Those are some of the things that you want to consider if you're thinking about staying on-prem. It's a great solution for some companies. Single site locations, it tends to lean better too. So then another consideration that comes into looking at cloud ERP is, where's your data center located? Location does matter, and that's part of just evaluating the cloud process in general. So here at the Estes Group, we actually do latency tests and evaluate that before ever pitching cloud to any of our customers or potential customers, because it's a critical piece. Your site might not have great internet, and if you're a single location and you're running off cloud, it might not be the best fit. It's also a consideration for data center location if you have users overseas, if you have users on both coasts. So this is a huge consideration. In modern day technology, a lot of data centers have networks that are pretty robust, that location on coast is not necessarily a deal breaker. So as long as you're doing that evaluation for, is this application, can you test it? Are you going to have those latency issues at the initial endpoint of looking at cloud ERP options? You can kind of see yourself out of this being a huge concern or risk. So then we get to really the last option from a cloud perspective. SaaS is usually stood up from either a direct vendor such as Microsoft, or public clouds also do a lot of SaaS deployments on their infrastructure. So really that final piece is private cloud. And private cloud can really develop out in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that's very functional for companies that are looking to move their ERP to the cloud is if they have an internal resource department that wants to manage that infrastructure. It's considered infrastructure as a service. This helps keep costs down. This allows you to not have to purchase new equipment on an annual or semi-annual basis for servers, resources. That all of that responsibility is now shifted over to the data center partner. So it is a pretty effective solution, as it most closely matches your on-premise solution if you are hosting your ERP on site. It's pretty much a replication of that environment, and it's managed by your company with full access. So infrastructure as a service is a great, and I think, initial step where a lot of companies that are looking to go cloud ERP evaluate, because they do want that layer of control. And this seems to be a really good fit on a private cloud because you retain that access. So then there's private cloud platform as a service, and this is more what you consider a managed ERP solution or a managed infrastructure solution. So this allows you to move your on-premise ERP to the cloud, but you have full access to the environment, the data. You can set up customizations, integrations, but some service or support will be delivered on the back end and manage those servers. It's a way to reduce IT costs. It's a way to shift the IT focus from managing that environment or those servers or resources to other functional aspects of the business. It's also very useful for customers that don't have a super large internal IT footprint. Platform as a service seems to lend pretty well because it sort of keeps their solution in the same ballpark of how they're deploying it today, but they don't have to manage it anymore. So it's kind of taking that layer of stress off of them. So at a high level, we'll reevaluate this slide later when we talk about at a more granular level, but this is just a snapshot of how it moves from on-prem to basically that platform as a service or software as a service, of the complexity of managing it from an internal resource. So on-premise you take care of everything. Infrastructure as a service, you don't have to take care of the networking as much, or the actual operating system from deploying it. A lot of times that's included. So it just kind of shifts those responsibilities. So some questions to ask yourself If you are looking at ERP and whether cloud on-prem what's the right approach for you are you an existing customer? Have you already purchased your licenses, or are you looking at kind of an implementation of a new ERP? Those are huge considerations, because usually if you're doing an implementation and you're not on an ERP, or you're looking to shift, looking at those cloud models, everyone's going to get different mileage out of them. If you own the licenses, you have a lot more flexibility and options, but you're also going to be limited by your third-party integrations and what kind of access that you need. So that's going to really dictate, are we a new customer, or are we looking to make that change or move into an ERP platform, because they're different evaluation processes. Another component to look at if you are thinking about cloud is, what is your implementation timeline and resource pool to make this transition to the cloud? In most of our deployments, I would say that it's between a 30 to 90-day window for implementation testing before production actually goes live. The more internal resources, the faster that process from a testing standpoint can move. But that is a huge consideration. A lot of companies have a set timeline of end of Q4, end of Q3 that they're trying to get this done. My recommendation from a implementation standpoint is look at your options and start planning that process sooner rather than later. So that way you can knock out some of those admin and logistics, get your price, get your budget, get your timeline set up so you can hit your company's metrics and timelines if you are looking to move your ERP application to the cloud. So then I want to move over to kind of our specific data center and highlights about that. So we fall into that private data center category. I don't want to get too much into all of the bits and bytes. You can kind of dive in, but from a compliance standpoint, we decided to leverage US Signal as our data center partner, as they really understand compliance and large scale migrations and integrations. So you get a lot of bang for your buck out of them. They have HIPAA compliance, they have the FBI CGIS certification, NIST 800, GDRP, ITAR compliant, and they are self-assessed for CMMC. They are just waiting on that final verification from auditing. So it fits for a lot of manufacturing or distributor customers that have those compliance requirements for their data. That's one of the reasons that we partnered with them. They do have a 24/7, 365 NOC, and they have a guaranteed response time of 60 seconds or less that you'll be speaking with a live person there. And then the other final piece that's pretty interesting about our private cloud that can do infrastructure as a service or platform as a service is that they have 100% written guarantee SLA uptime on hardware. I've never seen that before in the industry, and since we have been a customer, we have not had an outage from a hardware perspective with them. So they are a very, very good data center partner. So they're located in the Midwest. They've got 8 data centers. They sit on a private fiber network that they ran to all of their data centers, which makes for really robust disaster recovery solutions, as they do not have to go over public internet. So if you're looking at it from a business model, they basically built the train tracks and then also run the trains. So they kind of have a little bit of advantage when you are looking at robust failover solutions for ERP applications that have very low RTO and RPO times. So the other highlight about them is they are Cisco certified. They do run Cisco clustered environments for their application layer for the hardware. They do have HA developed for all of the solutions that we stand up by default. So that is included in our month-to-month pricing. So they basically have a 100% written SLA uptime. They have high availability by default turned on. And then they also do DRaaS solutions where they do an air-gapped DRaaS solution if security is of the utmost importance to you, which works very, very well for those manufacturing and distributing customers that are leveraging some of those ERPs. So to sum up kind of those cloud solutions is you obviously have a couple of those high level environments. You have on-premise, which can still be a virtualized environment where you have multiple people connecting in, and that is that traditional approach. You've got private cloud, which is what the Estes group really manages and delivers, which can be infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or managed hosting. We can also do a hybrid combination where we do some of the management and then they do some of the management. That fits for some organizations as well. So it's a pretty robust platform. And then you really have the public cloud, which has the software as a service solutions. They're built more from a less control standpoint, generally speaking, just from how they're designed. So knowing that, there are some of these options that you should take a look at and hopefully have a better understanding when it comes to ERP and cloud. So I'm going to turn it over to Daryl. As I said, we would revisit this slide and let him dive into more of kind of that technical approach when it comes to the IT side and looking at hosting or cloud options for your ERP.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate the handover. Greetings, everybody. My name is Daryl Sirota. I'm the VP of Technology here at the Estes Group. Got lots of good stuff for you today. I'm a little more geeky. And so therefore, I'm going to throw out a number of terms. If you have any questions, I am monitoring the Q&A side of the presentation over here on another monitor. So if I look over here, I'm not ignoring y'all. It's just that I'm making sure that you get properly serviced. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and share out a little more of the details when it comes to what it means to put your ERP in the cloud. So hopefully everybody can see the same IT responsibility slide that was presented earlier, but let me get a little bit more detail, because when we look at this stack of or these different rows in the table, I just want to make sure it's clearly understood, because a lot of customers end up with a surprise at the end of the day when they move their application, say from a traditional on-premise environment all the way up to the software as a service, because they lose some of the control that they might be used to. So when we look at these different layers, basically when you're on premise, you manage all of these things about your ERP solution, really, and that could be set of Exchange or Active Directory or any of those environments. And as you start moving into the cloud solutions, you start losing control and handing some of that control over to Microsoft or Epicor or whoever your SaaS provider is. And so be prepared for some of that transition to kind of, I don't want to say slip away, but maybe give away is a better term. So I'd like to take a closer look at what that really means. When we look at the individual components, we have layers of your application. So the first layer, or at the highest level, you can think of your application as a seat. Right there, you've got a user, and they want to be able to log into their ERP application. They get the application kind of in a fixed format. You don't always get the full control over how you access it. Here is, for example, we use Salesforce as an example. Right, when you purchase a seat of Salesforce, you pay a monthly license, maybe annual, to get a little bit of a discount, and that gives you, quote, Salesforce. And the way you consume it is the way they present it to you. You don't get a whole lot of choices. And when they say, guess what, we're moving you to the Lightning format, you get moved and you probably don't have a choice afterwards. Similarly, in a number of the SaaS models, you get upgrades are forced on you, maybe with a limited time window to do all of your testing. And it really does give you kind of the easiest possible solution, but the most potentially limiting solution. When you go a little bit lower down in that stack that I talked about, the application itself, you might have the application now being able to be delivered perhaps in a customized way. You might say, I need all of my warehouse folks to see it pink, and I need all of my office folks to see it blue. And when we start delivering at the application level, we might be able to customize that based on the needs of the users, right? The warehouse folks need to see it one color and the office folks need to see it another color. As you go further down in the stack, you might need to see your data presented in a variety of ways. We know a lot of folks that are in the ERP space that love to use Excel databases or Excel spreadsheets to query their ERP data. And that type of connectivity might be a requirement in your solution. So if you've got a refreshable report that's just got to have the latest data, you're going to need some type of connectivity to that data. And that might be some challenges. Some folks love to use SQL database management tools, right? Running SQL queries or Power BI queries against their data. And a lot of folks move their data in and out of their ERP system. So whether you do imports that are coming from your vendors, or EDI and exports that are going out to PDFs and customers, things like that, access to your database might be a critical question in your solution, or at least being able to be able to query that data in the way that you like to query it. Certainly availability is a big question there, and we'll get more into that as we move into the what does it mean to run SQL in the cloud. Then we've got a middleware environment. Now that middleware could be an application layer like SQL or IIS. If you run Prophet 21, there's a very clear server called the middleware server. Think of it where your application logic runs. And that's going to be a key component in the solution. Are you responsible for the middleware, or is the provider responsible for the middleware?
So, can I pause you for a quick question?
Absolutely. Got a question?
Yeah, I got a question. So a common theme that comes up a lot when I talk to customers is I think when people, some feedback I get is that SaaS isn't going to work for them due to access. And I think that with a SaaS solution, is there a reason that delays people or restricts people from having access to the SQL layer that you mentioned earlier? Because I see that as one of the hurdles that we run into with some integrations of people that are trying to look at SaaS. And what's the difference kind of if they were deploying on a solution like ours?
So it is a key pivot point, if you will, deciding whether or not to stay with a middleware or a database layer that you can access, as opposed to handing the keys over to the SaaS model, where by design, they generally don't let you have database access because, boy, you can do all sorts of horrible things to your data if you do bad queries. Heaven forbid you actually update the database. And for anybody who's looked at the traditional vendor support models, they say, well, it's your database. We can't, if it's on premise, for example, we can't do anything against you to prevent you from updating the database, but you quote, void your warranty if you start writing to SQL tables that you ought not to be writing to. So when you go to the SaaS models, then what they basically do is prevent you from having direct database access so that you can't do crazy queries that will impact the performance or reliability of your database.
So that's one of the big differences from our solution then, is that they can retain that control.
Absolutely. So in our solution, what we really want to allow is our customers to securely, maybe in a limited damage model, if you will, be able to access that database. So one of the key reasons we've got customers, even small customers, looking at the Echo solution is because their refreshable Excel reports will still run the same way they used to. It's just that their database is cloud-based instead of on-premise based. When you look at a SaaS model, they typically put a big red X in front of that SQL server. The only way you can get at that database is through the application layer, or perhaps even through the seat layer, right? The only way you're going to get to your data is to run a crystal report, or to write a BAQ, or to leverage the built-in tools of the ERP applications so that they can control how that access is done.
Perfect. Well,
what we've seen, go ahead.
No, I was like, perfect. That's one of the big things that I run into with customers is kind of that understanding piece of hosted, private hosted versus SaaS. And that's one of I think the defining factors is that SQL and management, what can you actually punch into?
Right. It's with great power comes great responsibility. And what's happened in the past is our customers on-prem have seen that as a given. It's my SQL server, it's my database. I'll query it any way I want to. Thank you very much. And when they hand that responsibility over to a SaaS provider, the SaaS provider might very well say, great, we'll host your application, but you're not going to have access to that SQL level, so you don't get all of the hooks and connectivity that you're used to. It's a big issue, right?
Awesome.
Thanks for the clarification. We'll get into a little bit more into that later as we go on. Okay, so continuing down the stack of those application that you are providing, we've got the operating system level. So if you have folks on-prem that are used to installing Windows and maintaining Windows and patching Windows and all that stuff that comes along with it, great. One of the benefits of turning that over to a provider might be that the provider now installs, maintains, patches, and backs up the operating system levels. As you continue further down the stack, there's actual servers that run those operating systems, box that have CPU, memory, disk, and network allocated to them. And if you're managing your own servers, then guess what? You get to decide what hardware you're buying. If you're doing it virtualized, which is fine, a lot of folks run virtualization on-prem, you get to decide how much of your VMware you slice out to your ERP solution. And then once you slice that out, then you have to monitor it, right? It's not just a given that all of these servers are going to run flawlessly all the time. You have to make sure that the CPUs don't overheat and that you have sufficient RAM and that your disks don't, run out of space, or that they don't have a failed disk. That's used to be a common problem in the world. Fortunately, RAID arrays are now commonplace, storage area networks and whatnot, so that your disk doesn't necessarily become an issue, but something you still have to monitor at that physical server layer. We can certainly get into the virtualization layer. If you're virtualized on premise, we see VMware and Hyper-V commonly used. There are other stacks available for virtualization, but that's a whole nother layer of the stack that you get to look at and decide, well, which physical hosts am I going to allocate to run which virtual hosts? Do I have enough resources? Is there the right virtualization drivers? For example, one of the key issues that I see in an on-prem environment is where folks have stood up a virtualization, but they haven't got the right network card assigned, or they don't have the right number of CPUs assigned. And that can create all sorts of problems from a performance and perhaps licensing perspective, which I'll get to shortly. Certainly down at the storage layer, when you're looking at the physical disks that you have spinning, okay, are they spinning in a storage area network? Are they SSDs? Are they flash? Are they spinning Rust? There's all sorts of fun things that you can do. And if you're managing your own storage, then you get to allocate that appropriately up to the virtualization layer to give to a server so that the operating system can be installed, so that SQL can run, so that your database is there, and Epicor or whatever your ERP solution runs hunky and dory. So there's a lot of stuff residing there on that storage layer. And depending on the complexity of your network, the networking layer itself could be a key issue. We not only have networking to get to the devices, but we have networking potentially across the enterprise, whether it's VPNs, storage area networks, IP subnets, access to other systems. There's a lot of stuff that comes into the networking component. And when you look at moving your ERP solution to the cloud, you're basically moving your networking off premise to the cloud provider, and making sure that you have appropriate and secure access to that. The rest of the stack is going to come into play. And when we look at moving a client over to the cloud, we basically look at all of these different options, because they're going to come into play when you do this migration, should you choose to do this migration. Usually it's pretty easy. It's, hey, what subnets are you using? What kind of storage requirements do you have? In our Echo hosting model, we chose the VMware environment for the most part. Some clients do look at the Azure model, and that's a Hyper-V model. We can certainly help you there, but our preferred method our preferred solution set has a VMware stack, if you will. Okay, so when you are moving up to the cloud, there's this little thing called SQL. You might already have an ERP solution that runs SQL. And there's a question as to whether you run SQL Standard Edition versus Enterprise Edition. There's lots of bells and whistles here. I'm not going to read down all the benefits of Enterprise. Oh, by the way, Enterprise does cost more money. And so therefore, if you want the benefits of Enterprise Edition, be prepared to pay a little bit more in licensing, whether you purchase the license and run it in the cloud or you rent the license. and run it in the cloud. There's a couple of different models there. But when you are looking at SQL licenses, the key factor here is we look at how many CPUs or CPU cores are presented. And when you install SQL in even the private cloud model, we have a minimum of 4 cores, and we add by 2 cores each. So you have to have a 4-core license to run SQL. In many ERP solutions, the SQL engine and SSRS, and for example, in the Epicor ERP model, requires SSRS to run. And if you run those both on the same box, that's great. It saves you a whole lot of licensing fees, but you have to license the number of processors that are presented to that SQL server. So we start at 4 and we go up from there. And in fact, most clients are fine on a 4-core server, believe it or not. If you're on-prem, we found that a lot of clients will actually allocate more CPUs to the SQL server just to make it go faster, but they never realize that each license or each core requires an SQL license. It's not just a free-for-all. After all, this is a Microsoft solution set and they need proper licensing in place. Some solutions also allow or tend towards multiple instances of SQL on the same box. So if you are running SQL production in an SQL test environment, for example, that's great. You can install an instance for production and an instance for test. And while they might be running on the same physical or virtual machine, they're isolated from each other. It allows you to get a separation of production and test. And some clients are really picky about that. Other clients are not so picky, right? We'll just run test and the pilot and live and import and training. We'll just run that all on the same SQL. We'll run that on the same middleware box, the same application server. No worries. We'll just let it roll because that's how they do it on-prem. In our environment, we strongly recommend the separation of church and state, the separation of production and test, in such that you don't want stuff that you're doing in the test environment to muddy, cross-pollinate, pollute, impact the production environment. There is a potential issue there. Microsoft made a fundamental change when they went to SQL 2017. And this thing called SSRS, if that's something you require, is a single instance only. So you can't do multiple instances of SSRS on the same VM. You would have to do them on a separate VM, which might require you to have a separate SQL server if you are truly a purist and you want to separate your production from your test. And we found this to be an issue for those clients that are looking to move to the Epicor Kinetic environment. This is a ERP 11, if you will. And for those folks that are trying to separate production and test, that does require a separate SQL box to separate the test and model out. We can talk more about why you want to, why you need to, maybe you don't need to. Those are all specifics to each individual client. But the reality is that SQL licensing is certainly part of the solution when you move from the on-prem up to cloud and up to SaaS. Now, if you're moving to the full SaaS model, you don't care because your SaaS provider is going to include the SQL licensing as part of the solution set. In fact, you probably don't get to see your SQL server in a SaaS model. But for those folks that the SaaS is not an option because they don't allow the access and the connectivity that you need, then we look at SQL licensing as part of the solution. And one of the things that us as Estes Group as a service provider can provide that licensing on a month-to-month basis. So a SQL license might be, you know what, we're going to have one SQL server this month. Maybe next month we decide that we want to separate the test from the production. So we'll just spin up another SQL server for you for, minimum 4 cores for SQL install, and that all can be rented basically on a month-to-month basis. Some clients do have their SQL server that licenses that they purchased, and if they purchase the right license with mobility, Microsoft also has that included as part of volume licensing, you might be able to move your SQL license to the cloud. Okay, remote desktop still is a function of many solutions. Depending on your ERP solution, you might require remote desktop or terminal server solutions. And if so, those RDP farms, they require licenses as well. You can buy your own or bring your own, again, if you got volume licensing on that, or you can use a service provider. So that's one of the key pieces here of an RDP farm, is making sure that not only do you have the resources to run the RDP farm, but you've got the right licenses in place. One of the great benefits of a lot of the ERP systems we're dealing with is that they're moving to a web-based model. So if you are, for example, accessing your ERP Kinetic environment through the web interface, you don't necessarily need to install a client. It's all, through Chrome or Safari or what have you. And that's nice because it uses IIS and doesn't require additional licensing for that solution set outside of the operating system that you're running SQL on and your middleware servers on and your integration servers. That web access component, again, just leverages the built-in IIS, which is really nice from a licensing and scalability solution. But on the other hand, as we all know, the web version of products doesn't necessarily equate to the on-prem or legacy client that you're used to, right? We have a lot of folks in the Prophet 21 world that are looking at this thing called web UI and going, I hate it, right? Because it's web driven, it's different. It's not my classic P21 interface that I'm used to. And Epicor, for example, is helping those users along to the web model by saying we've stopped development on the legacy client. Now in the ERP space, that's not the case. The legacy client's still available, but there are this new cool thing called the ERP Kinetic interface, which is a mobile web-based interface. And going to that web interface means that you don't need remote desktops. So we're actually seeing a sunsetting of the remote desktop model in many of our clients because, well, in the Prophet 21 space, by the end of this year, it's all you're going to have with support anyway, is going to be the web model. In the ERP space, the Epicor ERP space, we see a continuation of that legacy client, and you might still see the need for a terminal server farm. One of the challenges we see here is installing a smart client locally on your PC. While in our Echo solution, absolutely support that as long as the vendor supports us on it. That smart client can potentially create network bottlenecks. We see some of our clients that run the ERP client installed on their desktop machine. And as long as we take into account that they need perhaps a different size pipe to the ERP solution that's hosted in the cloud, there can be potential bottlenecks there. And I do want to point out that there's a potential challenge here when it comes to looking at the ERP performance when we install a client locally on the machine. So let me go ahead and jump into maybe some of the performance challenges that you've seen not only on-prem, but potentially as you move it to the cloud. Now, of course, we need to make sure that you have sufficient resources. Every computer has CPU, memory, disk, and network pieces in that component. And how much you need is going to be determined by how much of the user interface you're putting on a particular host, right? If it's a web model, then you're going to be having a web server. In the P21 world, they call that the middleware server or servers, depending on your size. The chosen interface that you are using is going to vary by the vendor, but it will certainly have a significant impact. So if you're running a terminal server with a bunch of legacy clients as a terminal server client, or you're running the newest version of P21 with the web UI, all of those types of solutions are going to require that you have sufficient resources for each of those hosts. And of course, you have to know what's going on. So if you look at the ERP solution, you go, gee, it's slow. Not that any of you have ever said that, right? Your ERP solution has always run blazingly fast, and it's clean, and my sarcasm is bleeding over here. It's one of the more common complaints of an ERP system. Certainly, as we move into this web model, the way you interact with the ERP solution, not only that, but the performance of that ERP solution can be a key factor. So we need to know what's going on. There's all sorts of tools, right? Task Manager, Resource Monitor, Performance Monitor. These are all Windows tools that are in there in the traditional SQL Server, middleware servers, terminal servers, application servers that we need to be able to keep an eyeball on. One of the things that Microsoft doesn't do well in the native operating system, though, is to be able to monitor the trend of those resources. You know, my servers are great early in the morning, but by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they're just dogged down. And we need to know why that is and what's going on to make sure that we've got our resources that aren't bottlenecking the system. And so there's a number of third-party tools that can come into play. Here at the Estes Group, we actually have 2 or 3 tools that we use on a fairly regular basis to make sure that your ERP solution is running it as best it can. And if there's a bottleneck, that we identify it and squish it, right? We want to make sure that your ERP solutions are running as best it can. Now, within the constraints of of what you're putting onto that ERP system, right? If you're running complex reports every minute, or you're running an import that has to do a whole lot of work, that might impact the performance of the solution. But if your business requires you to do imports every minute, then we need to be able to scale the solution. And what that usually turns into is either scaling up, making that server that's doing the work more powerful with more RAM or more CPU, or we scale it out. We add another server so that your scheduled tasks run on one box, or your task agent runs on one box, and all of your users are hitting another box. Or if you've got lots and lots of users, maybe we create a farm of servers to handle that user impact. And again, the size of the solution, the number of users, the amount of work that you're asking those folks to do is going to come into play. One of the huge benefits of our private cloud solution is that we can do that scale up and scale out very easily. If you've looked at Azure or AWS, you'll know that they present solutions in kind of a bundle. Here's an A4 machine that gives you 8 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM and this much IO. And that's what you get when you pick an A4 class machine in those Azure or AWS environment. And if you want to move up, then you're moving up to the next model, the A5, for example, and that's going to be 8 CPUs and 64 gigs of RAM. And it doesn't give you the ability to granularly pick how many CPUs, how much RAM, how much disk space, and am I going to use super fast all flash disks, or am I just going to use our regular flash cache with spinning disks on the back end? So there's a lot of different solutions that we can provide, and they're very granular. And that's one of the key pieces of picking the Estes Group solution over, say, Azure or Amazon, is because we can say, let's look at the load, and we'll add a CPU here or a gig of RAM there to fine tune it. And you might find that your load is bigger during the Christmas rush as opposed to the Valentine's Day rush. So we can actually spin up and down these resources as needed. There is a potential hit there when you spin down or take away resources. It does require a reboot. Just a full disclosure here, and a reboot might have to be in the middle of the night. That's okay. We can schedule those things. But that type of granularity to get the performance that you need when you need it is something that we can provide. Diving more into the SQL Server of things, I'm going to give some keys, some toys away here. This might be a valuable slide if you're responsible for managing your SQL Server. If you give your SQL Server to the Estes Group here in Managed Services, we do all these things for you. But whether index maintenance is a key part of any SQL Server, making sure that you are, if you're running a SQL engine and this thing called SSRS on the same box, that you're not fighting with each other. So Bitsum has a great tool. Microsoft used to give this back in 2008. Their operating system had a built-in CPU throttler or scheduler, if you will. And now we have to go third-party. Not hugely expensive, but if you're doing this on-prem, you might want to consider using Process Lasso to rein in those rogue SSRS reports. Certainly concurrent activities are going to be a key factor. Are you doing data entry and data reporting on the same SQL database? Because if that's what you're doing, you might create locking contention. We need to make sure that you don't have that, because locks will slow your system down. I've seen hugely powerful servers brought to their knees due to concurrent activities. There's a great sanity check tool, Brent Ozar. If you're not familiar with the Blitz a series of checks, this is worth its weight in gold to look at your SQL Server and make sure that you're not doing silly things. And then if you have a need for ongoing SQL monitoring, Quest has an awesome tool. The free version is pretty awesome, but the paid version even longer term trends and even more awesome. Spotlight Cloud is a great tool so that you can get a handle on your SQL Server. The ERP security realm, again, this is a little more agnostic, but some things to keep in mind when you're putting your ERP out there. Now, this is whether you're on-prem, hybrid, private, public cloud, I don't care where your ERP lives, but make sure that you keep a control of your users, right? Account management is going to be key. A lot of folks are talking about multi-factor authentication, right? In this day and age of hacks. If your ERP is exposed to the cloud, to the general internet, that is, that, you know, folks from, oh, I don't know, overseas in a particularly hotly contested environment right now, they might be knocking on your ERP door, and we need to make sure that your ERP solution isn't available to the bad guys, right? For example, in our Echo solution, by default, we only allow US IP addresses to communicate with your ERP system, okay, by default. And we can even lock that down tighter. Only if you're sitting in the corporate office or VPN'd in can you access the ERP system. And even then, we're going to enforce a multi-factor authentication so that you have to have your phone close by when you go to authenticate. So we can add these layers of security as needed, because certainly when you take that server and you take it out of your basement or the closet of your server stack in your on-prem environment, there's lots of benefits, right? You get 100% uptime SLA on the hardware, but we also need to make sure that it's only the appropriate folks that are accessed. Certainly patching. Patching is part of the ERP bane of existence, not only the Microsoft and SQL and IIS patches that are needed, but the ERP patches themselves. One of the benefits of going to a private model like our solution is that you get to pick when those ERP patches are put in place. We have clients that say, you know what, I'm on version X and I don't want to move from X because it's the end of month. If you're in the SaaS model, they're going to say, we're upgrading you to the latest version in your test environment this week, and in 2 weeks, we're pushing you to production. And that patching of the ERP system might be forced on you, and business be darned. Chris, you had a question there.
I did. One of the questions that comes up very frequently when we're working with prospects or people that are kind of looking at cloud options is there a right answer to best practices for if we're going to go latest version on our ERP? Should we upgrade before we do a migration? Can you do them in tandem? What does that look like? And do you have any recommendations on best practices?
Gotcha. So the best practice is that which makes most sense for the business. So I can't say that you should always upgrade in place and then migrate to the cloud, or migrate to the cloud then upgrade, or maybe we'll just migrate to the cloud and not upgrade. Right? We face this issue with the vendor support all the time. We see a lot of clients that are running on-prem legacy solutions that are 5 versions old. And the vendor looks at that 5 version old software and goes, dude, we can't help you, right? So the first thing you need to do is upgrade. Now, a lot of clients will look at that upgrade effort and go, well, I can't upgrade because my servers are old, or I don't have enough disk space, or I don't have a test environment in which to upgrade it. So one of the most common solutions we see is take your Epicor or ERP solution, and we're going to move it to the cloud in the latest version. So as we do the testing of not only does the cloud work for us, but does this newest version work for us? Now, that is the most complex move, right? We're lifting your database and we're moving into a newer version in the cloud. So there's a lot of variables involved with that, not only with just the ERP solution, but now all that third-party integration. Okay, so we're not only moving the servers to a new IP address, but we're giving you server 19 and SQL 19 and ERP.latest. And so that does create a lot of testing. However, at the end of that migration effort, not only are you cloud-based, but you are in the latest version vendor supported version of the ERP solution. And for a lot of our folks, for example, that run Prophet 21, this is a key factor because Epicor is pushing hard and heavy to get you out of the legacy clients by the end of this year. So definitely a factor. And patching certainly comes into play in that.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yep. It does actually add two big variables to the mix. There's an infrastructure piece that says we're moving servers and we're upgrading servers and we're installing new servers to support this ERP, but then also we're adding the functional aspect of now we're moving into the latest version of the ERP. So what does that look like? How does that feel? How does that operate with your business processes? And so it does add, there's a lot of moving parts in that type of an upgrade. But at the end of the day, you end up with kind of the best of both worlds. You're not responsible for the boxes on-prem anymore. You don't have to worry about your hard drives blinky, in the closet. We see a lot of smaller clients where their servers are outdated. They're out of warranty, but hey, they're running, so let's not touch it, which is not the right mindset.
So basically, the kind of the end point is we can support businesses no matter which option is going to be the best fit for their organization when it comes to either an upgrade and a migration in place, a migration then upgrade. We can kind of really support all of those different avenues of what's the best fit for the customer.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's we look at the business model and how complex it is, and what is it going to mean to actually migrate versus upgrade versus both. We see different clients that go about it different way, and a lot of that depends on the resources that are available with the client. Do they have the bandwidth to be able to test something? If they don't have any bandwidth to test the new version of the ERP software, and they have no business drivers to go to the new version of the ERP software, we might just keep the same version and move it into the cloud. And that's okay. With the SaaS model, you don't get that. You must go to the SaaS model. Their latest version is what they're going to kind of force you to eat.
And if I've learned anything in years of being in this IT space is IT people really love being told they have to do something.
And do it by the end of the month, by the way. Right?
That makes sense.
Okay. Being able to backups and disaster recovery, which are often conflated. Backups are where we do your backups of your systems so that you can restore a config file or a SQL database or something like that. And disaster recovery is what happens if we get a nuke dropped on our data center, right? Maybe, hopefully not a physical nuke, but the power went out. We see a lot of smaller clients that whether they're multi-location, and right now their ERP system lives at headquarters. And if the headquarters internet goes out, the branches are down, right? Or if the headquarters takes a power hit or a tornado hit or a whatever hit, that they don't have the disaster recovery or business continuity plans in place to keep that ERP system running while they don't have power or they're under 2 feet of snow or what have you. So one of the key benefit drivers of moving to the cloud is all of that moves to a data center that's a real data center, right? With security and backup generators and redundant internet connections and all that good stuff that many small businesses don't have the interest in investing in that level. And there's a false sense of security that, just because your server has stayed running for 5 years in the closet doesn't mean that the dust bunnies aren't attacking it right now, and it will overheat and it will fall down. And if you don't ever test your backups or your disaster recovery plans, you might be in for a really bad day when that server turns into a smoking crater in the ground. Part of the security model also talks about access, authorization, and auditing, and I won't get into that too much here, but it's all about security and making sure that only the appropriate people can access your system. And when they access your system, that they're only authorized to access the right menus or screens or data that they need to get their job done, and that you audit that. So you can see that audit log of this is where a user came in and did this and did that. Now, just FYI, in the P21 space, you might find that your audit log is half the size of your database. When we do a lot of migrations of P21, we see this thing called the audit table, huge. Because they didn't ever realize that this is audit history from years and years gone past, that If you don't need it, go ahead and purge it, and you make your SQL database a lot smaller, easier to migrate, but that's just me. If you need it, by all means, we'll bring it over. Lastly, on the security, malware and endpoint protection, the bad guys are still out there. The problem is when you install antivirus on a server, it isn't always smart enough to exclude the right files from the scanning. Don't scan SQL databases with Symantec antivirus. It will kill the performance, and heaven forbid it thinks it finds a virus in your SQL database, it will quarantine it for you. And if it quarantines it, oh, by the way, your SQL server is no more, everybody goes down. It not only hurts performance, but it kind of hurts productivity if the malware scanning takes care of quarantining bad file, quarantining what it thinks are bad files. And there's factors when it comes to your ERP solution. When you look at your ERP solution, the vendor will say, don't scan these files or these locations because we use them a lot, and malware scanning simply slows things down, and you're not going to drop a virus in there, at least not intentionally, of course. So we need to make sure that when we host your servers here at the Estes Group, we're going to make sure that, yes, you've got protection, and yes, it's got the right files excluded so that your performance is sufficient. So we do have a preferred data center, and kind of bring it home here. I don't see that we have any questions here at this point, so I'll just go over at a high level. Our preferred data center is fully redundant. As Chris mentioned earlier, we have a 100% written SLA on both the hardware and network access. You will never lose your ERP because a disk went down, or a switch failed, or a CPU got too hot. Those things are completely, that layer on down are completely provided by our data center. In fact, if we do the disaster recovery as a service, we'll mirror all of your data and settings over to another data center. So heaven forbid Grand Rapids goes down, or the East Coast power grid goes down. We're actually going to be seeing more of that. I hate to say it, but as the bad guys figure out that our infrastructure is not invulnerable, it might be that the East Coast power grid goes down. And so if we mirror everything over to the West Coast power grid, we can fail over fairly quickly, especially when we test it and make sure the failover is smooth on a regular basis. We can fail over to a data center that's on the West Coast power grid. And that's one of the reasons we pick our data center in Michigan, because it straddles the East and West Coast power grids, which is really cool when you think about it. Okay. Of course, any ERP solution that you have in place, we need to monitor. And I want to kind of leave you with this. Pretty lights that go blinky, blinky, making sure that your servers are properly running. And what I've done here is, these are just a couple of the remote monitoring and management tools that we use, and some of the charts that say, are all your servers happy? Are they patched? Do they have enough disk space? Is ERP responding well? Are we not overloading any resource? And so we have our NOC that sits here and watches these graphs, and they know when something red pops up that we get a ticket and we jump on it, and we might fix servers before you ever know that they had a problem, right? That's the ideal solution, is that your ERP solution stays running as performance and functionally and securely as possible, and you guys don't have to watch it. On the other hand, if you like watching your servers, if you like watching lights go blinking, blinking, and watching event viewer logs, by all means, we'd be happy to turn those functions over to you. And you can use whatever management tools that you use, managing both your on-prem solutions, maybe Azure or Amazon solutions, as well as solutions that are hosted up in our private cloud environment. So with that, I really appreciate all your time. Do we have any other questions that we might want to bring on? And poof, and I exited that slideshow, so we'll go ahead and stop sharing here. Any questions that we can answer for folks? Wow, that's the sound of crickets that I've ever heard one. Okay. And being respectful of everyone's time, it is the top of the hour, and I've held you for way too long. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, we do have our contact information that is in the presentation, which will be made available to all of our attendees that registered. We appreciate all of your time, and we look forward to seeing you out there on the web.
Thanks, everyone.